My name is Paul J. Murphy. I was born in Chillicothe, Missouri in 1924, and I went to school there at high school. In 1943, I graduated from high school, and 2 weeks later, I was drafted. And I felt very fortunate. It was one of the first times that the Navy did any of the drafting. And then I went to boot camp at Farragut, Idaho. And from Farragut, after boot camp, I was selected to go to a fire control school at San Diego, Treasure Island. Not San Diego, Treasure Island, for 4 months. After I completed that course, I was selected to go to advanced fire control school at San Diego, which was another 3 months. So I had 7 months of training shore-wise before I was assigned to the USS Indianapolis. And of course, I was aboard the USS Indianapolis, the heavy cruiser. That was, in peacetime, was the ship of state for Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He made 2 trips to New York, a couple down to South America, and one to the Aleutian Islands during that peacetime period. We were his ship of state in peacetime. Where was the Indianapolis when Pearl Harbor got hit? 3 or 4 days before Pearl Harbor, it was sent to Johnston Island for gunnery practice. My ship was not involved in Pearl Harbor. Is that ironical? I don't know. And because of the accommodations that were set up for him, Admiral Spruance selected our ship to be the ship of Fifth Fleet flag. And that had accommodations for his complete staff and his entourage. And Admiral Spruance was in charge of most of the Pacific operation while I was aboard. The model builder, when he gave this to our organization, and I'm only the caretaker of it until we get a museum back in Indianapolis, he said that when he started building this model, to get the plans for it, the Navy would give them the plans for it. And you know where he got the plans for the ship? From Russia. Now, he did tell us that National Geographic is going to have him build a 7-foot model, a wartime model of the ship, and a 7-foot model of the Arizona. And they plan on traveling or taking that worldwide to display it. He valued this model at $9,500, which I think there's probably a lot of time put in here. This was modeled during peacetime. That's the way it looked during peacetime. So there was a lot of equipment put on later. Like we've got 2 catapults and 2 biplanes that can fly off of the catapults, and there's extra planes down in the hangar deck. An 8-inch gun was used for bombardment or surface attacks. The 5-inch and 40 millimeters and 20 millimeters were generally for air control. 5-inch could be used for bombarding also. Being in the Navy is a lot better than being in the trenches over in Europe. Those guys, the frozen feet and the mud and the stuff that they had to go through must have been terrible. Again, it's pretty hard to comprehend. If you're going to be on a ship, it's best to be on during wartime because it's a little more lax than it would be in peacetime. It's not so much spit and polish as it is in peacetime, but we had all the accommodations anybody would ever want. We had 2 doctors, MDs. We had a dentist. We had a gee-dunk stand, which is an ice cream stand. And we had ship service. So we had a barber. We had a laundry we could use. Mainly, I guess, on our off hours, many of the boys played cards. And we had good dining facilities. The only thing that was kind of ironical is Wednesday mornings and Saturday mornings, we always had beans for breakfast, Navy beans. I was in charge of this after control tower, and that's what was my cleaning station also, and I also had to calibrate everything. And I had a young crew, and I was young myself, but I had newcomers on there that, they saw me cleaning up around there, and they'd sit on the deck and read funny books and stuff like that. And finally one day I got fed up and I said, hey, if anybody's going to sit down and read, it's going to be me. You guys get this cleaning done. So that's basically about what it is about. The ship was 610 feet long, so it was quite large. And when the admiral was aboard, we could see him walking the forecastle for exercise, talking to somebody from his staff all the time. And Admiral Spruance was a fantastic individual. He was probably one of the best admirals in the Pacific. And he was also from Indianapolis. When you were out in the Pacific, it was quite, the tropical temperature was quite hot, and we had no air conditioning. So many of the boys that worked in the engine rooms or slept near those engine rooms at night would take advantage of sleeping on the upper deck where the cool breeze could blow them. They'd bring their hammocks or their blankets and lay down on the deck. In fact, that night we got hit, many of those guys were sleeping in their skivvies on the deck to keep cool. I was just one deck below the main deck, and it wasn't too bad in my quarters to sleep. I don't remember ever sleeping away from my bunk. My friend that was in the after control tower slept in there because it was cooler than where his bunk was. I was working with the 8-inch guns, so you never fired those at airplanes. You fired those at surface targets or bombardment. So I was an observer most of the time. Whenever we were under air attack, I could look out the porthole of my control tower and see what was going on and how the firing would get. But many of the guys in my division were in charge of the computers and so forth on the 20 millimeters and the 40 millimeter guns and the 5-inch guns, and they would be more in the area of easy attack. I was sheltered by my control tower. The ship had 10 campaigns during the entire war, and I was involved in 5 of them. After we completed the Marianas operation, our next tour was Iwo Jima, and in between times the flag would go with the aircraft carriers, and we made the first carrier raids on Japan. And came back and completed the Iwo Jima operation, and then we were involved in the first Philippine Sea battle, where the carriers again were in operation. And they shot down in one day 412 Japanese planes. To that date, it was the largest number of enemy aircraft shot down in one day. Most of the combat areas that I was involved in were the bombardment prior to invasions. And we had the flag to protect. Like in the Marianas operation, we would go in during the daytime, bombard, but we would always leave that area at night to protect the flag, and we'd go out to the fresh air and the fresh seas, and we never realized what the stench was until you started to come back in to be close to the activity again, and you see the green flies and the Japanese bodies floating in the water, and the stench was something terrible. Then that next evening we would go back out and get that fresh air again, and it would all change. I think during the Marianas, it was probably one of the first times that the Navy ever took prisoners and interrogated them. The Japanese wouldn't give up, but they brought some prisoners aboard our ship, and they were interrogated there, deliced and so forth. That was the first time that I was made the pointer on 8-inch guns. And the pointer is the guy that after the crosshairs are marked on a target, pulls the trigger, and the computers do all the rest of the work. And It was the first time in the entire war that I was told that we fired a 9-gun salvo broadside at one time. Each turret had 3 8-inch guns, and there was 3 turrets. And then when you fired those shots, you could see the shells go over towards the target, and the roll and pitch of the ship was terrific. It really made it roll. But we had gyroscopes on to compensate for that type of stuff as far as firing is concerned. But you could look through the telescope and see the shells going over, and you'd see them building, and it hit, and it blew it up. And that was, fortunately, I had a stool to sit on when I was looking through the telescope, because if I hadn't had that, my knees were shaking so much that I don't think I would have done a good job. We were only within 10 miles of Tokyo when we made the first carrier raids. We let the carriers' planes fly over. So we never got real close to shore. But we did go in there almost undetected and really bombed the hell out of the planes and so forth. Japanese Navy at that time, right after Iwo Jima started, was pretty short on ships. And the only ones that were out there would maybe be fishing boats or scouts out there that would see you. But we went in at night, and we didn't have any loss. I know that Franklin got hit later on when we were coming back out, and was hit by a kamikaze, I suppose. We could see it getting burned up in flames. Next operation was the Okinawa operation. And as you might know, D-Day was Easter Sunday, 1945. And the day before, March 31st, we were attacked by kamikaze planes. We shot down 6 of them, and the 7th one got through and exploded and landed in the after part of the ship on the back towards the fantail. The engine and the bomb went through the ship, and it exploded under the ship and blew a large hole in the bottom of the ship. We lost 9 men, and 27 were injured. The Japanese at that time were throwing everything that could fly at the fleet. There were 151 destroyers involved in that operation. And of that, there were 121 of them hit by kamikazes, either sunk or damaged or could be repaired. There were 10 cruisers and 10 battleships also hit. We were one of the cruisers. We were towed over to an island called Karamaretta, and in a 24-hour period of working straight through, the Navy put a temporary concrete bottom in the ship, and then we limped back to the States and went into dry dock at Mare Island. In the meantime, Admiral Spruance and his flag transferred to the New Mexico, which was a battleship, and it later got hit with a kamikaze. And then he transferred back to Guam to prepare for the invasion of Japan, and Admiral Halsey took over. In June, while we were in dry dock, I went home to see my folks, of course. My mother was sitting on the edge of the bed, and she looked like death warmed over. And I scolded Dad, and I said, "Why isn't she in the hospital?" And he said, "She won't go to the hospital until you boys come home." She had 4 boys. So before I left, my dad and I took her in an ambulance to St. Louis, Missouri, which was 250 miles away. The ambulance didn't have air conditioning, and the only reason she wanted to go to St. Louis is her family, her brothers and sisters were all living there, and she wanted to be near them. She had a goiter that was sapping all of her strength. We got her to the hospital, got her entered in Barnes Hospital, and I asked for Red Cross emergency leave that I could be there when she was operated on. The report came back that her metabolism was so bad that they couldn't predict when they could operate on her. So I had to leave her there in the hospital, went back to the ship. I had no communications or correspondence to know how she was doing. We were in dry dock 8 weeks, and we finally got our ship repaired and increased new equipment, including radar and gunnery. And before we had a shakedown, we were called on to make a speed run to the Pacific Ocean. The reason we were selected to do that is because we were fast and we were large enough that we could travel alone across the Pacific to the Hawaiian Islands and then from there to the island of Tinian. They loaded on a large crate on our quarterdeck, and it was bolted down and guarded by Marines. It was some kind of a secret weapon, but we didn't know what it was, neither did the captain. And so we proceeded to Hawaii and got refueled and supplies taken on and proceeded to Tinian Island in the Marianas. Our cargo was offloaded. Now, we were instructed that every day that we could shorten that trip would end the war that much earlier. So we knew we had something on it that was very important. The cargo we were carrying was the components for the atomic bombs that were later dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I don't want to ever hear anybody condemn us for dropping those atomic bombs, because that saved as many American lives and many of the Japanese lives if we'd had to invade, because the Japanese would not have given up. They would have gone to their emperor and done what his wishes were. The Navy is, of course, notorious for having scuttlebutt. If you don't know what's going on, you make up something. And you know, the best thing I heard about that crate that we were taking over to Tinian, somebody said there was 50,000 rolls of scented toilet paper for MacArthur. And that always I use as in any talks I ever give, because it's kind of comical. And of course, it was just the atomic bomb. It was offloaded at Tinian, and then we proceeded to Guam to get further instructions and supplies. And from there, we went to the Philippine Islands. But our instructions were, when we left Guam, is to proceed to Leyte. We would be met by planes carrying sleeves for target practice, and met by the USS Idaho for surface practice. Because we had taken on about 25% new crew, and of that number, probably around 250 at least, were the first time that they've ever been to sea. We will arrive at Leyte on about the I guess around the 1st of August. Our other instructions were that we could zigzag at our own discretion. That was the captain's orders. And that also he requested an escort across the Philippine Sea, because in that time, anybody of a ship the size of a cruiser, battleship, or a carrier was supposed to have an escort, because they could detect whether there were submarines in the area. And they had sonar device, and those ships like ours did not have sonar device. We left Tinian on July the 26th, 1945. We were told that we would not need an escort because it would be safe waters there. Later we found out that the Navy knew that there were submarines in that area. And they also knew that a ship, the USS Underhill, was sunk 4 days before we got there in the exact path that we would be taking. And they never told us this. basically because they didn't want the enemy to know that they had been able to break their code, and we knew what the Japanese Navy was doing all the time. On July the 29th, which was a Sunday in 1945, my captain went to the officer of the deck around 10:30 that evening, and because the moon was hidden by clouds, you could barely see the bow of the ship. So he told the officer of the deck, "You may cease zigzagging and call me if there's any changes. I'm going to retire." He retired to his quarters, and shortly after midnight, and incidentally, I was on watch from 8 to midnight that night, and I got off about 10 minutes early probably. So I went back to my quarters, which was an after part of the ship, one deck below on the fantail. And I retired, went sound asleep, and about 10 minutes after midnight, a Japanese submarine was surfaced, charging his batteries and observing, and off in the distance he saw a little black spot, and he submerged, raised his periscope, turned it at 360 degrees, and saw this ship was coming towards him, and it was not escorted. So all he did was wait until we passed. At about 10 after midnight, he fired 6 torpedoes. 2 of them hit us. The first one blew off about 40 feet of the bow. The second one exploded under the 8-inch magazines, under the 8-inch guns, and exploded. So I slept down here, and when the ship got hit, I went to my general quarters station, which is arranged a little differently than the scenario shows. And I stayed at my quarters there until the ship had turned clear over and the guns in the next deck below were completely underwater. I found out later that about 40 feet of the bow was blown off when the first torpedo hit. And the second one hit below the first 8-inch gun turret and exploded in the powder room. So all power was knocked out, and the bridge was not able to contact the engine rooms to turn off the engines. And while we were underway with no bow, we took on water rapidly, and that's what caused the ship to sink so rapidly. It went down in between 12 and 15 minutes. After the explosion, I was told later that they sent one of the officers down to see if he could get the engine turned off, and he got severely burned and never returned. When I arrived at the control tower, I undogged the door, and lo and behold, lying on the deck in there was one of my best friends, and that guy by the name of Paul Mitchell. He slept through the whole thing. I had an extra life jacket. I gave it to him and told him to go to his general quarters station. And later I found out that he was able to get off the ship, but he only lived 2 or 3 days in the water. As the ship started rolling to the starboard side, and after about 30 degrees, and quickly going to 45 degrees, the 5-inch guns, which were on the deck below me, were covered with water, and all I had to do was step off without jumping off or anything else. And I swam as fast as I could and jumped into oily water, and we swallowed an awful lot of oil and salt water. And we spent most of the night vomiting and throwing up this oil and stuff. The ship went down in about 12 minutes. That's very fast for a ship that size, but it was because we took on so much water. Isn't that a beautiful ship?
It is.
It's still at sea, rotting away. Any ship that's sunk is still at sea. The next morning when the sun came up, we found 2 floater nets that had floated off of the ship, and we also found 2 life rafts that were cut loose and so floated off. We got no lifeboats or anything else off of the ship because we went down too fast. In fact, we didn't believe the ship would sink probably for half of that time. We tied these 2 floater nets together in the 2 rafts, and in the group that I was with, there was approximately, I'd say 250 to 300 men. And we all tried to stay together. We used the rafts for those that were most severely hurt, put the injured on there. It wasn't much better than what we were in because they were, half of their body would be in the water. He was blown off of the deck where he was standing, and the ship rolled over and he just got washed off. And you know, ironically, he was one of the guys that found a raft when he got in the water. So he was on a raft all the time. And while he was on there, he gathered up a couple, I think he had as many as 7 or so on his raft eventually. But he thought there were no other survivors. He couldn't see any of the rest of it until towards when they started drifting together. And you can imagine the thought that went through his mind that I should have gone down with the ship. We were in the water for 5 nights and 4 days without food or water. Many of the boys hallucinated, thought they could swim to the shore, to the islands that they supposedly saw. And those that went off by themselves were the ones that were most susceptible to sharks. The rest of us tried to take care of each other, but many of the boys hallucinated, and because of dehydration and so forth, felt that the ship was just below the water and they could swim down and get a cool drink of water below the surface. Many of them took their life jackets off, swam down, and swallowed salt water. And when they came back up, you can't imagine what it's like to see somebody that's devoured a lot of, or swallowed a lot of salt water. They were worse than the worst alcoholic drunk that you've ever seen. They came up and they were wild, and you couldn't stand to be around them. When they did this and came back up, it was only a short time later, an hour to 2 hours at the most, that they just went berserk and died. And that was the worst tragedy, I think, of the whole thing. I know that the sun was blistering during the daytime. We were getting sunburned from reflection. We were praying for the night, cool air. And at night it was chilly and cold, and our teeth chattered, and we prayed for the daylight and the sunshine. And this was repeated. I took my shirt, cut off my shirt tail and put it over my head, probably after the second day, to protect my face and eyes and nose and lips, which were becoming quite festered. And probably didn't see a lot of the things that might have been going on during the daytime. Many of the boys saw sharks and dorsal fins and so forth. Because I'm from Missouri, I would not have known a shark from a catfish, but we did have schools of supposedly sharks come up to our area, and we would splash and holler, and they seemed to let us know. I know that the sharks or some kind of a fish was bumping our legs, and we'd pull our legs up because they were dangling. And I also think that sharks don't like Irishmen, because I never had a bite, and I was pretty fortunate. On the 4th day, shortly at mid-afternoon, plane was flying in towards us, making a circle. And we thought, well, they must be looking for us. But the funny part of it was they were out looking for submarines, Japanese submarines. And he was testing a new device, a radio antenna, dropped out the bottom of his plane to give him longer distance of communication. And just before he got to our area, one of the cables holding that antenna broke loose, and the antenna was flopping around. And they went down, and he got down on his belly and looked down to fish up this antenna, and he saw oil slick in the water. We had drifted back into our oil slick. This was the fourth day. And he started to fish up this antenna, and he quickly ran back to his pilot seat. And the crew said, "What's the matter?" He said, "Look down and you'll see." And he immediately opened his bomb bay doors, and he was making a bombing run on us, thinking there was a Japanese submarine in trouble. And as he went down to about 2,000 feet, he started seeing heads in the water, scattered over several miles. This pilot's name was Chuck Gwynn, and he was flying a PVC-1. We always called him our angel. Anyway, as he came down, he saw heads bobbing in the water, and he immediately wired back to his base in Peleliu and told the officer in charge there, who was second in command, that there's an emergency, send out all possible help. They sent one PBY out with supplies. PBY got out probably, well, they don't fly much more than 180 miles an hour, so it was probably another 2 hours or so. And he got out there and started dropping his supplies, the life rafts, kegs of water, food. The water broke when it hit the surface. And then his crew saw that there were men scattered over 25 miles. And he immediately wired back to the base, and the commander was in charge then, and he did not have the previous message. And he sent one PBY out. And the first one, piloted by Adrian Marks of Indianapolis, decided to break all Navy regulations and attempt to make an open sea landing, because his crew and himself saw that the stragglers that got away from groups were more susceptible to shark attacks. And he immediately dropped into the water, landed in 8 to 12-foot swells, popped a few rivets. Could have been court-martialed for that had it not been so serious. And he started picking up men. When the other pilot was flying around, he would direct him where to taxi to get the stragglers. And before the evening, before darkness fell, he had picked up 56 men, piled them in the aisles like cordwood, and tied the rest on the wings with parachute shrouds. And his crew gave each of the survivors half a glass of water, half an ounce of water, and then after they had completed that round, then they went again and did the same. The plane taxied past our group, and we made sure that those that needed to be out of the water were the first ones to get on. That was the first time that anybody knew that the USS Indianapolis had sunk. He immediately wired radioed again, breaking regulations, openly telling of his location and asking all ships in the area to converge on his location. 5 ships started coming in to rescue us. The first one that got there was probably around 2 or 3 in the morning, and it was USS Doyle, and it was commanded by a man by the name of Graham Clador. Graham Clador, unbeknownst to him at the time, his he's a relative of our captain. And also later in his career, he became a Secretary of the Navy under Jimmy Carter, and has been to our reunions once to speak in 1990. But at any rate, he took off the 56 men off of the plane and picked up 36 more and proceeded back to the Philippines. Ironically, what he did also, as he was approaching our area, knowing that there was a possibility of running over some of the men, he shined his 24-inch searchlights against the cloud to let all the other ships know where he was, and also to let the survivors know that help was on the way. There's debate, in my opinion, whether that was a good idea or not, because many of the men exhausted themselves trying to swim in that direction. And I'm sure that some of them succumbed before they were picked up. Anyway, the ship that came in next was the USS Bassett, and that's the one that picked me up. It was a fast attack transport, and they had landing craft on the ship, and they dropped these landing craft off to go around just like you would have a lifeboat and pick up survivors and then take them alongside the ship. And when they picked me up, they took me alongside the ship, and they had a rope ladder down, and I thought I was capable of climbing up that ladder, and I got up 2 or 3 rungs and I fell off, and they put me in, like they did everybody else, in a wire basket and took us up to the deck, cut off our clothes, which were black, and put our oil-soaked bodies in on the shower floor. And the crew tried to wash off the oil with diesel oil and so forth. And then they gave up their white bunks for the survivors. And that ship picked up 151 men, and we left that ship in a mess. We immediately headed towards Samar, in the Philippines. And when we arrived there, they trucked us over to the hospital. And I can remember that I was laid on a rubber-sheeted bed, and they poured liquid penicillin over my entire body to heal the saltwater ulcers and clear up the sunburns and so forth. I don't, to this day, have any idea how long I was there, but I think it was close to 10 days. And then we were all flown from there to Guam in a cargo plane, set on the floor. And when we got to Guam, we entered a submarine rest camp, which was just ideal. Those that were still in pretty bad shape went to a hospital nearby. The rest of us recuperated in the rest camp. We had steak every night, beer if we wanted it, and they served gallon buckets of ice cream every night. And then eventually we all gathered, and the USS Hollandia, which was a small carrier, took the whole entire group to San Diego. And we arrived in San Diego around the end of September. Now remember, we were sunk on July the 30th. And then we disembarked there, and we were given 30-day survivor's leave. Hiroshima was bombed on the 6th of August. Nagasaki on the 9th of August. The Japanese surrendered on August the 15th. That was the first time that the newspapers announced the Japanese surrender and that the USS Indianapolis had sunk with 100% casualty. You can imagine what it was like for those parents to see that. And the Navy kept it quiet until they could put it out at the same time, which would happen. More importantly, the war ended. 880 lost their lives. Probably of that 880, probably near 300 died when the ship went down. And the rest died in the water because of delay in rescue and so forth. My dad received a telegram that stated that I was wounded and had multiple wounds immersion, but I was recovering. Anyway, when I left San Diego to come home after we returned to the States, I got train fare and went back to Missouri on a train. You know, train rides back in those days, it's unbelievable. They were the filthiest rides and the slowest rides you'll ever get. The windows had to be open and the coal dust came in and you get covered with all that crap. And anyway, we got home okay. And I got to Kansas City and I knew that I hadn't told anybody I was coming home, but they didn't know anything because we weren't, the only mail that we mailed out of there was as if the ship was still afloat. They didn't want us to say anything about it. So when I got to Kansas City, I decided I better call home and see what's going on, because I didn't know what condition Mother was in or anything. And a gal that was taking care of the house and taking care of Dad while he was working answered the telephone. I said, "Is Dad there?" She said, "No, he's working." And I said, "Well, this is Paul, and I'm on my way home, and I'll be in Chillicothe." I think it was an hour or two. And just let him know that everything's okay, and he doesn't have to meet me. So I get to Chillicothe, and he's there. And, you know, he thought, "Oh, God, I'm going to have a leg missing or something," you know. It was quite a reunion. The Navy, Admiral King in particular, insisted on, because of the publicity, on court-martialing my captain. He became the scapegoat. There would not have been a court-martial if one of the boys that were lost hadn't had a dad that was very influential back in Washington, government contractor, and he put the pressure on, and he became the scapegoat because some of the admirals that were in charge of some of the policies and principles that they had out in the Pacific were much more in need of being court-martialed for not rescuing, knowing full well that we did not arrive at our port on the designated day. They took the ship off the plotting board and assumed that our orders were changed. Nobody looked for us. And there were also 3 emergency messages we found out later that got off of the ship and were received by various places. And one of them was to a Commodore in charge of the area in Leyte, and he was awakened and was smelling a lot of liquor. And he told the serviceman, "If you hear any more, wake me." Although another thing, too, is Admiral King, who was the chief of naval operations, was the one that called the court-martial, even after Admiral Nimitz and Admiral Spruance suggested that they have no court-martial. A letter of reprimand would be the worst that he should be done. And Admiral King, we found out later, when he was a junior naval officer back in the Asiatic Pacific area, my captain's dad was an admiral. There was a Navy family. But he reprimanded King for some wrongdoing, and it was the only record that King had in his personnel file where he was reprimanded for anything. And we felt that it was probably a way to get back at the family. The captain, after this all happened in 1968, was continually receiving cards from parents who did not know what the situation was, that blamed him and said, "If it weren't for you, my son would be home." and he went outside the front door and shot himself with his .45. Fact of the matter is, the day that he shot himself, he had a card from one of them. A year ago in September, we testified before the Armed Services Committee, John Warner and Bob Smith, and got a lot of attention then. And Warner, it was a former Secretary of the Navy also. He also slept with Elizabeth Taylor. And he was very open and candid about it. He wanted to investigate it a little bit more, and he was with us for about 4 hours. And then they put the bills together, but the House of Representatives was a little bit more in favor of going the whole way. The Senate didn't feel that they would get it through, so they softened it and didn't say anything about the court-martial or about the presidential unit citation. The Navy left it that they might give us a Navy citation. Well, we don't. If we can't have the presidential, we don't want anything. But I think it's going to work out fine. Congress exonerated the captain in 2 areas: that he was not responsible for the loss of his ship, and that he was not responsible for the loss of the crew. But they would not throw out his court-martial. At the present time, we're trying to, Clinton had an opportunity to do that from December the 4th until the end of his term, but he was too busy pardoning about 140 people, and he didn't have time for our ship. So now we'll be working in the near future on the new President Bush and hoping that we will get a presidential unit citation for the ship and crew, and that he will throw out the court-martial. There's always so many underlying things that happen with tragedies as such as this that it makes you kind of wonder, how the heck did we get such a nice nation as we've got with all the troubles that we go through? I was at Shoemaker, California, and they broke a 52-year rain record there that year. And we all had to stay out of the barracks from 8 to 5, walking around in the rain, I guess. And I developed a lump under my chin, and I'd go to sick bay and they'd give me APC pills. And I did that for 5 days, and I went back on the Saturday, and I said, I'm going to lay it down to you guys right now. I'm either going to go to the hospital tonight, see a doctor, or I'm going to request captain's mask, and nobody wants that. So they put me in the hospital, and the next day I saw a doctor about every 30 minutes, and they put me on penicillin. Back in those days, it was new stuff. They only give you 20,000 units at a time, so you get a shot every 3 hours, and I got a shot every 3 hours for 9 days. 72 shots. And after the last shot, the doctor says, well, you're cured, you can leave now. And I said, well, what did I have? And he said, well, let's look at your records. So he looked at my records and he said, well, you have cat fever, according to this. That's what anybody that had fever in the Navy was classified as cat fever. I just hung around Shoemaker until after December, and then they sent me to Great Lakes in Chicago for discharge. I had enough points. And I was discharged on March 16th, 1946. They gave me a physical there to make sure that everything was okay. And ironically, one of the things that they did, when they examined my ears, the doctor pulled out some gauze that was in my ear, which was probably put in there when I was in Samar. Many of my high school buddies were home that still lived, and we generally went out every night and had a few drinks. I learned how to drink that time, and by summertime, it was decided that those that were going to go to college would not do anything until the following September, and those that were going to be working would just play around until the following September. So we sat and had our drinks. By the middle of summer, I was starting to realize what a hangover was. Because anything that I drank, the only way I could get it down, I never liked beer, was to take a shot and then follow it with a chaser. The middle of summer, I determined that I had to learn how to drink a highball. And I did conquer that. And then I entered school on the GI Bill and went to Missouri School of Mines and Metallurgy at Rolla, Missouri. And I earned a mechanical engineering degree, graduated in 1950. But in between times, in the summertime, I worked for the U.S. Geological Survey making topographic maps. And Central Region headquarters was located there in Rolla. And I had a real good friend that had an uncle that was involved with that. And when I graduated from college, there was too many engineers on the market at that time. And the best job that I could get money-wise was continuing to work for the government. Because I got $7 a day per diem for 7 days a week. And they furnished me with a sedan delivery truck. And I never owned a car before. So I was high on the hog there. So I worked 3 summers with the survey, and then I continued to work another year and a half with a professional rating because I didn't need any training or anything. So when I got out of the survey, left the survey group, I was a GS7, which was pretty darn good. And sometimes I wonder, I should have stayed with it and then did what I wanted to do later after retiring from that and double dipped. But I got married and I went into the lumber business in Minnesota, and I stayed there for 22 years, ran some lumber yards for our family. And then in 1974 I came out here and visited my brother Bill, who had a manufacturer's rep business, and he was trying to entice me to come out and join him for several years, and I finally decided I would do that. So after 1975 I came out. I moved to Broomfield. I've lived here ever since. And he and I ran the business until 1983. He's 3 years younger than I, and he thought he'd worked too hard and he wanted to retire. And offered me to buy the rest of the business, and I said, no, I'm not interested in owning it. So we sold it to a corporate outfit in Houston, Egelhoff. In 1983, Bill retired, and I worked with Egelhoff. I stayed on with them to make sure they paid off our contract. And in 1994, I retired at age 70. I like Broomfield. I like everything about it except getting into politics. Because when I was back in Minnesota, I was on the school board, I was on the city council, I was in every office of the Rotary Club and the Chamber of Commerce, and my community efforts in that area are over. I'm heavily involved with this USS Indianapolis Survivors organization. I've been the chairman for 5 years, and my wife, I talked her into being the secretary. I think that everybody that's in business should sleep with his secretary. My wife and I really throw are full hard at it. We've got you ought to see the basement. We got a merchandise we sell to try to make profits for the organization. The organization is in financially better shape than it's ever been. Some of it's from our efforts, some of it's from efforts of an artist and a friend we got back in Indianapolis, that there's going to be 30,000 National Firemen's Convention in Indianapolis. And these guys sell our merchandise there and promote our goodwill and so forth. And we're going to have to send a truckload of stuff back there for them to sell. 1999 at our reunion, we had a guest speaker by the name of Jim Irsay. And he gave the welcoming speech on a Thursday night. Our banquet was on a Friday. But he came from the Colts training station and gave a heartwarming speech. And he said at that time, he said, during the speech, he said to me, "How many survivors are here tonight?" And we told him there's 83. He says, "I want the name and address of each one of them, and I'm going to, and their shirt size, and I'm going to send each of you a Indianapolis Colts jersey." And he did this. Then after he got through with his speech, he said, "You know, I'm so impressed with you guys." He says, "I'm going to also, when I get back from training camp, I will write your treasurer a check for $83,000 with instructions to send each one of you $1,000 to help cover your expenses." And boy, was that ever a windfall. And then this artist friend of ours, he started a Adopt a Survivor program, where he went to different corporations and so forth and asked for at least $300 for each survivor so that they could pay their hotel bills and feel pretty good about it. He raised enough that we got $500 for each of the guys that were there. So we got $1,500 last year. We have a 900 mailing list, and that mailing list includes families of lost at sea, survivors and their families, former crew members, rescue crew members, and we've got an awful lot of good support. I don't think there's anybody that's got hard feelings about it. It's just one of those things that happens. It's war. Shouldn't have happened, but it did. Most of the men, like all World War II veterans, I think, never talked about their hardships, because you could be sitting next to somebody that had it worse. And you'll see that in your films, because there were many, many men that had it worse than we did. But it's very hard to imagine what it was like being in the water that long. Once we started having reunions, 1960, then we were with people that had like situations. And we started asking questions and elaborating on what it was like and stuff like that. And then there were several books written on it. But I think we found that it's probably a healing factor, that you can do that. And then my own family, I have 5 children. They never knew much about what I'd been through. And in 1985, all of them came back to one of our reunions in Indianapolis. And they got to meet youngsters from other families. They got to meet other survivors. And they started to know my story. That's the first time. A guy that I know in Missouri that's never been to a reunion, that his daughter is going to take him next time. And we've had 2 other guys last year that had never been to a reunion. So it's really heartwarming when you can get some of these guys for the first time to come back to a reunion, because that is all healing for those guys to meet with some of their buddies and realize that we're all in it together. And it's working out very well. The captain came to our first reunion in 1960. He was invited, and he came reluctantly because he didn't know how the crew would feel about him. But when he came there and found out that every one of us would be glad to serve under him again, he was pretty happy. And that broke the ice for him as far as the living members were concerned. And it was just that black mark that he had, and the feeling that some of the families felt that he was responsible. The reaction that I get is a good feeling about our youth today. Some of them are so caring. It's just wonderful. And that stuff that's going on at the Regis University with their things that they're trying to create there at Regis is not only involving veterans that were in war, but women and families that had to stay home and create the industrial power and the sacrifices that they had to make in order for us to build up our armament. And then you get the Black Air Force, you get the Holocaust people, you get Army people, you get Air Force people, you get Navy people, submariners. It's fantastic. I didn't have it so bad, I tell you. When you hear some of those prisoner of war men and women and the Holocaust and the foot soldiers that went across for Europe. Of course, we had that in the Pacific somewhat, but it was better temperature out in the Pacific than it was in Europe. We were invited over, my wife and I, to the hula parade and Christmas parade, which is on the day after Thanksgiving. And then I found out the week before we go over there that I'm going to be the Grand Marshal in a parade. So I rode in a 1946 British convertible, a beautiful little car, and there were 29 stateside bands, high school bands there. And the interesting thing about that was there was one band from just outside of Indianapolis there, from Indiana, of course, and I was able to participate in their festivities at the Civic Center before, not on the memorial. And then one of the guys that asked me to come over there gave me a flag that flew over the Arizona for one day to give to this high school band instructor and the students, and they were so thrilled. And then they wanted to march behind my convertible in the parade, which was kind of interesting. And they were all of those kids were great students. Then we went back again for December the 7th, and our organization was honored and allowed me to lay a wreath with USS Indianapolis on it on the memorial out at Pearl Harbor. They closed the visitor centers. That was for families of the Pearl Harbor survivors. And then on the memorial, I don't think there was over 150 invited guests there.
Representing the USS Indianapolis Survivors Association, Mr. Paul Murphy.
You are watching survivors from the Pacific Fleet who served during World War II, presenting wreaths during the USS Arizona Memorial Service on this 60th anniversary.
But it was a beautiful ceremony. It was just great. And then Admiral Conway, who was in charge of the Honolulu, or that area of the Pacific, had all the guests over to his house afterwards for a brunch. And it was beautifully done and very, very gorgeous. The Navy gave us a suite for $40. And then we had to get up at 5:30 because there was a sunrise ceremony. And after we completed that ceremony and so forth, we went back to the airport. And then after we got back from Pearl, we had already been to San Diego and Dallas, Texas. Yeah, and I talked to both places, and then we went Minnesota, and then seems like Washington D.C. I was there for a day on their Veterans Day thing, and I had to get back real quick from that to appear at Stanley Lake High School, their Veterans Day program, which is beautiful. They do a good job, and then we went to Kansas City and St. Louis also. So it was full 6 weeks. We got tired. It's expensive to do things that you really have a heartfelt feeling for. That was 60 years ago that Pearl Harbor happened. Quite a ceremony. Things changed a lot. I often thought about Pearl Harbor Day. What did you do at that Sunday? And you know, it's hard for me to recollect what it was. So I tried to remember on September the 11th. Now, this is going to be important. And all I can remember about it is how dastardly it was and how we watched television all day long to see in astonishment what happened where the terrorists took our old planes and used them as kamikazes, killing the crew and many of the people that were in those buildings. I just hope that the citizens of this country don't come forth with a few more of the people that think we're doing the wrong thing. I just can't understand that. And we got some rebels living in this country. and I think we all should stay right behind Bush and do this job to its ultimate end, if it's possible, and show the world that the world does not have to live with these terrorists and these people that don't have any value of life. This is as bad as Pearl Harbor. Only we aren't fighting a group that are capable of fighting like the Japanese did. But, and you know, it's ironic how we've accepted the friendship of Japan, and Japan has accepted our friendship, and we're trying to live in a peaceful world. I hope it continues. World War II veterans and Korean veterans are dying at the rate of 1,500 a day. Our 317 survivors are now down to 124. So we're all numbered. It won't be long before what you're doing will help history for the next generations to realize how terrible wars are, and that we hope no more of them will happen.